Today's guest is James Emanuel, an investor with a multi-decade career in the finance and banking industry who runs a private long-only equity fund which aims to have permanent capital invested in exceptional businesses. James has come today to talk to us about his second book, Fabric of Success. Welcome, James.
Of Success, which is available on Amazon. I don't know if you can see that. So in the course of my investing career, I regularly engage with C-suite executives, and I raise constructive challenges where decisions or a course of action makes little or no sense to me. And this has happened over the decades, hundreds, thousands of times. And it often feels like Groundhog Day. I'm raising the same challenges again and again and again, albeit to different CEOs and different CFOs. But, the really interesting part is the response that I receive. Most of the time, they'll say something like, wow, I've never looked at it like that before, or that's an interesting perspective. And even more interesting is that this kind of discourse often brings about change and a beneficial pivot in the direction of the company. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't claim to be a guru of business administration. Everything I know, I've learned from others, from reading, from watching, from discovering what success looks like. The advantage an investor has over a corporate CEO is peripheral vision. So a CEO knows everything about his own company. One would hope he's an expert on the industry in which he operates, and he may have limited knowledge about the business of his competitors. But, think about that for a moment. That's a really narrow field of focus. Now, contrast that to an investor like myself, who constantly analyzes all sorts of businesses in different industries and different countries. Now, as an investor, I'm going to be reading quarterly and annual reports. I'm going to be engaging with other investors. And I kind of come to learn what success looks like, what works, what doesn't work. So my field of focus is far broader, so I can introduce these challenges from what I've learned from others. So, it's no surprise that an investor can introduce new perspectives to corporate management. And that's when I thought to myself, well, how valuable would it be to capture these perspectives, these valuable perspectives in a book that I could share with corporate executives, particularly those running the companies in which I myself are invested. That way I can see the benefit. What I did, I thought about the structure of the book. And rather than looking at great CEOs sequentially, one of my favorite books is The Outsiders by Will Thorndike. Most people have read that. But as you'll know, he focuses on 8 exceptional CEOs and he takes them one at a time, one chapter at a time. Instead, what I've done is in 53 chapters, I've looked thematically at various aspects of running a business, whether it's cost management or capital allocation, decentralization of operations, avoiding bureaucracy, succession planning, dividend policy, aligning interests of insiders and outsiders, so on and so forth. And each one of those themes is dealt with in its own chapter. And then I look at how each of these exceptional CEOs have dealt with each of those themes, and I compare and contrast the approach. And what I found really fascinating is that despite these fantastic CEOs, and I focus on about 150 of them in total, despite them being located in different geographies, operating in different industries, and some of them operating in very different eras, they all seem to converge on a very, very, very similar approach to dealing with each of these topics. Even more importantly, while they didn't all start with a similar methodology, that's where they all ended up. They all learned what worked throughout their careers, and they kind of learn from each other as well. And some of them have the same mentors, and the same people will inspire them. And they all seem to converge through trial and error on a very, very similar approach. And so it would be silly, really, for anybody running a business today to ignore this approach. By reading the book and by learning a little bit more about how these people have achieved such outstanding success, a CEO can almost kind of skip a few stages in the evolutionary process and kind of hone in on some of those things. One of the key things is that none of these people are unafraid to break from convention. They understand that being better means doing things differently. Yet again, despite being unconventional, they've all converged on a very, very, very similar operating model. So when writing The Fabric of Success, the book, the objective was to pull on these golden threads that run through the fabric of every great business. And yeah, I'm exceptionally pleased with the result. And crucial to our discussion today, by identifying these golden threads, it becomes possible for me as an investor to spot them in other companies, which is how I find hidden gems in which to invest myself.
You've mentioned the importance of the leaders of a company. Why do you think this is so often overlooked by other investors?
It's interesting. So too many investors buy into a narrative. They don't ask about the quality of the business and its management. So, by way of example, let's consider the dot-com boom at the turn of the millennium. Every top tech company back then was considered golden, and as long as it had .com after its name, people were happy to throw money at it, regardless of the fact that it wasn't profitable, and a lot of them were highly unlikely to ever be profitable. So very few investors considered the ability of the CEO to deliver. To me, that's back to front upside down thinking. They invest blindly, and frankly, they deserve to lose money when the bubble burst. And there are parallels to be drawn with what's happening today in the AI sector. Everybody's throwing money at AI. Valuations have gone crazy. A lot of it makes absolutely no sense. So rather than investing on a theme, investors need to learn what ingredients makes a great business and then look for those ingredients. And some of these are in very dull, unfashionable industries. For me, the key ingredients, I'll call out 5 of them now. There are certainly more, but the 5 key ingredients are people, culture, capital allocation, timescales, and aligned incentives. And I'll speak about some of those today. I could certainly speak for hours on all of this stuff, and that's why I've written the book. But I'm going to try and narrow it down. So let's start with people, because I think that's the most important factor, and it goes to the question that you just asked me. The person steering the ship is so much more important than the ship itself. So, how many equity analysts value a business based on peer comparisons, peer company multiples? In my opinion, they're barking up the wrong tree. Just because company X trades at 30 times earning doesn't mean that every company in that industry can justify the same multiple. Sorry, it's just a flawed logic. There are lots of e-commerce businesses, but there's only one Jeff Bezos. So let me give you some kind of historical examples, which I think really hammer this point home. So consider Sam Walton, who created Walmart, probably the most successful grocery store on the planet. So I don't know if you know the history of Sam Walton's life and career. Made in America is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend it. So anyway, he set up his first store in Newport, Arkansas. And it was running for about 5 years, and it was so successful. It was the most successful grocery store in the state. But he made a critical error, which he calls out in the book, and it's been a regret throughout his life. And that error was that he didn't negotiate a lease renewal clause in his rent agreement for the store, for the premises. And the landlord was a greedy man, and he noticed how successful the store was. And so at the end of the 5-year term, he said to Sam Walton, "I'm not going to renew your lease." And Sam Walton had all of the key ingredients that had made the store such a huge success, and he lost everything because the landlord wouldn't renew. And instead, this greedy landlord gifted the store as a going concern to his son. Now, Sam Walton was knocked down, but he got back up and he set up other stores in other states and other locations. And it wasn't for 10 years when he got to his 8th or his 9th store, I can't remember which, that he came back to Newport, Arkansas, and he opened that 8th or 9th store in Newport. Now, what's critically important here is that Sam Walton got knocked down. The first 5 years of his career were effectively wiped out, but he got up and he built up the franchise that we know as Walmart today, which is incredibly successful. And the store that he opened 8 or 9 years later in Arkansas also cleaned up. Now, the critical thing is the store, which was the leader in the state, which the landlord had gifted to his son, came to absolutely nothing. What does that tell you? It's exactly the same business in the same location, and all the key ingredients were there that Sam Walton had introduced. But the change of ownership made all the difference. One was a failure, one was one succeeded and it became incredibly successful. And there are other examples. You can look at McDonald's, the McDonald brothers, Dick and Mac McDonald. They were happy with a single restaurant location, and it wasn't until Ray Kroc came along and persuaded them to scale up that McDonald's became what we know it to be today. Had it not been for Ray Kroc, McDonald's probably wouldn't have been anything except for one diner in San Bernardino, California. And so again, it's the person that makes a difference. It's not the business. Looking at Warren Buffett, great example. He says the single most important decision in evaluating a business is the management. He said he looks for people with talent, with character, and a high degree of integrity. And he says if you have those three things, you've got a tremendous business. But most equity analysts, they don't put any kind of thought or consideration into the quality of the leadership. They become obsessed with quantitative analysis. They plug numbers, as you said, into DCF spreadsheets, and they miss the most important qualitative part. Now, don't get me wrong. I've got a host of models and spreadsheets myself that I use, but they're never my starting point. I need to identify the quality of the business first before I waste my time analyzing the numbers. But before I move on, if I may, let me give you one other fantastic example. So, let's think about a company we all know really, really well, Apple. So Steve Jobs is what I call a circumstantial CEO. He never set out. I mean, if you look at his academic background and what he did before he set up Apple, he never set out to be a businessman. That wasn't what he was all about. He never set out to be the CEO of a public company either. It kind of happened by chance. He was pursuing his passion. And his passion at that time was to democratize technology by creating accessible, user-friendly digital tools that could change the world. So he didn't set out to create a $1 trillion company. Apple was simply the vehicle that he established with Steve Wozniak to achieve his dream, his passion. Now, the really interesting thing is that at an early stage, the writing was on the wall about how successful he was likely to become. So, again, we're very familiar with Henry Singleton. He's one of the great CEOs that Will Thorndike wrote about in The Outsiders. Now, not many people know this, but he was a very early stage investor in Apple. This is when personal computers were just coming into being. Now, hundreds of computer company startups appeared, but very few of them succeeded. Most of them, withered and died. But Singleton was subsequently asked how it was that he chose to invest in Apple over all of the others. And how it happened that Apple turned out to be the winner. And his response was simply that he'd been really impressed by Steve Jobs. It was the person, it wasn't the company. He appeared to Singleton to be a man on a mission, who was evidently committing everything he had to achieving that objective, and that distinguished him from all the others. And so, just to kind of hammer the point home about him being what I call a circumstantial CEO. Establishing a company and raising seed finance was the easy part, but the skill set to create a successful business is rarely the same skill set required to drive the company forward. None of us would jump behind the wheel of a car without taking driving lessons, but many people jump behind the steering wheel of a company equally ill-prepared, which obviously leads to poor decisions, particularly in relation to capital allocation, corporate strategy, and this is where most businesses falter. Essentially having the wrong person steering the ship. So, handing over the control to someone else is never easy, especially for somebody who built the business himself from scratch with a major portion of their personal wealth invested. But Jobs, to his credit, recognized that he knew nothing about business administration. And so he brought in a seasoned executive. He brought in John Scully from Pepsi, as we all know. But the problem was he selected the wrong man for the job. And Scully clashed with Jobs and fired him. We know the story. So the most valuable asset that the company had was Steve Jobs. Scully disposed of that asset. And that was just one of a host of bad decisions that Scully made during his tenure. And Apple's fortunes declined under Scully, taking it almost to the brink of bankruptcy in 1997. Allegedly, it was 90 days away from running out of cash. But Scully was removed from the board, and Steve Jobs was brought back in, and Steve Jobs rescued Apple from the jaws of insolvency and put it onto a trajectory to where it is today, $1 trillion company. So, what does that tell us? Same company, same target market, same industry, but the difference was the person steering the ship. The outcome could not have been more different. And so, as the investor, the first thing you need to look at, I think, is the management and who's in charge and how passionate are they? What's their mission? What's incentivizing them? And so, the lesson to be learned is that we as investors are not looking for the next Apple. We're looking for the next Steve Jobs. So, let me take that a stage further. And sorry to kind of drag this out, but I think it's quite important. So after Scully kicked Jobs out of Apple, he founded the software business Next, which eventually became the Apple OIS operating system. And he was also instrumental in the success of the animation studio Pixar. And then later in his career, when Pixar was acquired by Disney, Jobs became Disney's largest shareholder. He joined the board and he helped transform Disney's fortunes as well. He influenced its strategy, and he also played a role in the appointment of Bob Iger as CEO. So if you've been able to invest in everything that Steve Jobs touched, you would have done incredibly well. So, once again, the takeaway here is you've got to invest in the people, not the narrative. And it's not about the ideas. And so, I don't know if you've ever read the book Creativity Inc., which was written by Ed Catmull, the CEO of Pixar, where he kind of insisted that ideas come from people. And so the people are always more important than the ideas. And he always said that getting the team right is the necessary precursor to getting the ideas right. And he stressed that a good idea in the hands of a mediocre team is like giving a bottle of champagne to a child. And didn't we see that with Apple and Scully? It was a fantastic idea, a fantastic company, but he was a mediocre manager, and nearly crashed the company. But if you give a mediocre idea to a brilliant team, they'll either fix it or throw it away and come up with something better. And this repeats itself again and again and again through history. Just think about Intel under Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Andy Grove. They initially started a memory business in a commoditized market, which was a mediocre idea. But they realized it was mediocre, and so they discarded it and came up with something better. And that resulted in a pivot into semiconductors, and the rest is history with Intel. And then, just to hammer the point home, just one more example, if I may. Xerox PARC. I don't know if you're familiar with it. PARC, spelled P-A-R-C, which was the Palo Alto Research Center, was established by the Xerox Corporation in 1970. And it was responsible for pioneering many, many groundbreaking computer technologies. And those included the GUI, the graphical user interface, the computer mouse that we all use today, Ethernet networking, laser printing, and even the first personal computer, which was called the Alto. However, Xerox failed to capitalize on many of the PARC's inventions commercially. And the GUI is a great case study. And, I focus on this in the book, and I'll just tell you a tiny bit about it. So the graphical user interface was introduced at a time when everything before that was command line DOS. And so introducing a graphical interface made computing more approachable for the average person. But Xerox didn't do anything with it. Steve Jobs was inspired by the work that had been done at Xerox PARC, and he developed the first commercial GUI at Apple for his Lisa computer. That was in the early 1980s. But of course, we know he was focused on hardware sales rather than software. So he didn't commercialize the operating system and the GUI. He made it available exclusively on Apple machines as a means to propel the sale of the hardware. And that very much opened the door for Bill Gates to come along. And it wasn't really for another 5 years. Bill Gates had witnessed the power of the GUI that Apple had developed. And so he developed Windows. And instead, he took a very different approach. He wasn't interested in selling hardware. Instead, he was focused on software. So he made Windows available to anyone, everybody, whatever computer system you were operating on. And that opened the floodgates for widespread adoption of Microsoft's operating system. And by 1994, he'd grabbed 90% market share. And so, the GUI was the springboard for both Apple and Microsoft to succeed, albeit pushing in different directions. Apple used it as a means to sell hardware, Microsoft used it to succeed in software. But, the critical thing here is you've got three CEOs. You had the CEO of Xerox, who developed the technology, but failed to commercialize it, failed to do anything with it. And the other two CEOs, of course, are Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And both of them built fabulous, multi-trillion-dollar companies effectively on the back of that GUI idea that was developed by somebody else. So once again, it's not the idea, it's not the narrative, it's the person. It's all about the captain of the ship. It's all about the CEO.
So you've made these different characters, and can we put on some of the these golden threads, particularly from an investor's perspective?
Yeah, sure. So one of the other golden threads is timescales. And this kind of links up very neatly with people that we've already been discussing, and it also links up with incentives. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about timescales. Rome wasn't built in a day. We're all familiar with that saying, and so decisions need to be made with a bias towards the long term. I don't know if you're familiar with the semi kind of reclusive investor, Anthony Deeden, who's based in Switzerland. He's deliberately almost cut himself off from the financial world because he doesn't really want to be corrupted by all of the white noise. I guess it's probably why Buffett's out in Omaha. But Anthony Deeden tells a really wonderful story. So in the course of his investing, he meets up with all sorts of businesses. And on one particular occasion, he was traveling to meet with an Arab date farmer who was happily planting sapling trees in his orchard, if that's what you call them. And Deeden asked this date farmer, how long will it be before these trees yield commercially valuable fruit? And much to Deeden's surprise, the date farmer tells him that it's going to be 40 years. And it's almost certainly not in the lifetime of this farmer, who by this time was in his kind of late 50s. But the important thing to bear in mind is this date farmer is happily planting these sapling trees that are going to yield no benefit to him throughout his lifetime. He could instead have extracted today's earnings to enrich himself, and chosen not to invest in these saplings. But his mindset was that his job, his duty, was to protect, preserve, and enhance what he was given to manage, effectively the date farm. He saw his role as being the trustee of assets owned largely by others. In this case, it was family, but in the case of a public company, it's clearly the shareholders, and that was his mission. And so, he was very grateful for generations that had come before him that had planted the trees that were yielding the fruit that was providing him with a living today. And he saw it as his duty to do the same. He was making decisions based on, multi-decade outcomes. Now, isn't that the kind of business that you would like to apply permanent capital to? And think about great CEOs that we're more familiar with, people like Jeff Bezos at Amazon. Now, you can read his inaugural shareholder letter back in 1997, and in particular, a section under the heading, "It's all about the long term." He said in that, "We believe that a fundamental measure of our success will be the value we create over the long term. We make decisions and weigh trade-offs differently than other companies. We make investment decisions in light of long-term market leadership considerations rather than short-term Wall Street reactions. So, isn't that the same kind of mindset as the date farmer? He's looking very, very, very long-term rather than the short-term. Just like Apple from day one, the clues were there. Amazon had the key ingredients. That letter was written in 97, which was the year of the IPO. And so, all of the clues, we've learned earlier how Henry Singleton spotted Steve Jobs as being someone who was exceptional and someone he wanted to invest in. Similarly, in that inaugural shareholder letter that Bezos wrote for Amazon, the the clues were all there. He had those key ingredients to make it a great company, and so it was. And so essentially, whether you're looking at Bezos or Jobs or Sam Walton or even Thomas Edison, what do all these people have in common? I would say none of them were in it for the money. They were all on a mission, and wealth was kind of an indirect consequence of a job well done. But unfortunately, these great leaders are in the minority. Unfortunately, most CEOs are mercenaries. They've got no passion for what they're doing. They're only really in it to enrich themselves. But chasing wealth is the wrong way to do things, and it leads to making poor decisions and unfavorable outcomes. And I think the best example I could probably give you is Twitter. Look what happened to Twitter. It enjoyed an IPO in 2013, and it was taken private by Elon Musk a decade later at almost exactly the same share price. Now, bear in mind that Twitter never paid a dividend throughout its lifetime. In real terms, accounting for inflation, the price paid per share by Elon Musk was actually lower than the IPO price. And so it was a miserable time for investors. They'd invested for a decade with a negative total return on their investment. Meanwhile, Jack Dorsey, the CEO, propelled his personal net worth over the period from $0 to $4.5 billion. And that was all on the back of stock-based compensation and all sorts of other means of extracting value from the business. So, Twitter was the right idea, launched at the right time with a huge addressable market, but it failed commercially because, it was being driven by the wrong people. So again, we're coming back to people here, with the wrong mindset and the wrong incentives. And that's probably why Mark Zuckerberg described Dorsey as driving a clown car through a gold mine. That's effectively what he was doing. But too many investors buy into the narrative. They see Twitter launched at a time when social media is really coming into its own, and so they buy into the narrative and they invest in Twitter, and they put their money on the wrong horse. They pay no attention to the quality of the jockey. But the writing was on the wall all along. The stock-based compensation was egregious. It was outrageous, and you could see the company was making absolutely no progress. And it ended where it ended, and investors suffered as a consequence. So a company in the right hands would compound in value, but in the wrong hands, time was simply a full more damage to be done. And that was summed up nicely by Buffett. He said, "Time is the friend of the wonderful company, but the enemy of the mediocre." So that's one of the key ingredients. We're talking about timescales, and looking not to appease Wall Street, not to look at short-term metrics, earnings per share, but instead investing for the long term, even if that means that earnings are low. A lot of people misread Jeff Bezos. He took a very similar approach to John Malone. So anybody who knows about John Malone will know that he reinvested most of his earnings back in the company, and he deliberately tried to keep earnings as low as possible because earnings attract the tax man, and taxes are a bleed on corporate capital. And so instead, Malone resolved that you're far better off reinvesting as much of your earnings as possible into growing the business, and then you're effectively growing at the expense of the tax man. And Bezos did exactly the same. And there were so many equity analysts over the years who said, "Can't invest in this company because the earnings multiple is way too high." Well, the earnings multiple was only way too high because Bezos was deliberately suppressing earnings. He was deliberately, reapplying all of the capital that he could into the growth of the business. And over the long term, over the course of the last 20-25 years, we've seen the results of that.
So you mentioned all these amazing CEOs. What would you say are the traits that they share that are common to them?
So they're all on a mission. They are all focused long term. Very interestingly, McKinsey did a piece of analysis where they kind of resolved that the most successful CEOs have an average tenure of about 11 and a half years. Now contrast that to the average tenure of a public company CEO in America at the moment. It's little more than 4 years. Now, think about that. So why should that make such a huge difference? Well, think about what Charlie Munger always used to say. He was always so focused on incentives. Didn't he say, show me the incentives and I'll tell you the outcome? So, these most companies are run by what I call career CEOs. They jump from one company to the next every few years. They collect big payouts along the way. They're very much like coaches of sports teams, but with one critical difference. If you think about it, a sports coach is focused on the short term. They're only looking at the current season. They want to win a trophy this year. But building a company for a CEO is a long-term endeavor. It's completely different. This is what I spoke about when we discussed the date farmer and Jeff Bezos. So, just put that in context. If the average CEO is only in office for 4 years, do you think that they're motivated to do what's best for the company and its shareholders for decades to come? Or do you think that it's more likely they're focused on doing whatever's necessary to hit short-term remuneration targets to enrich themselves? I'd like to kind of lean into this a little bit and give you a fantastic example. So you're probably very familiar with Lou Gerstner, who was the CEO of IBM over the turn of the millennium. He's always praised for being such a wonderful CEO. But I think the narrative around Lou Gerstner is completely wrong. His tenure was completely misunderstood. So, let me give you an example because this really hammers home incentives and why this is so important when evaluating companies. So, Thomas Watson effectively founded IBM after leaving the NCR, the National Cash Register business, which was another wonderful business, well worth studying, that Charlie Munger was always very focused on. Watson moved from National Cash Register to what became IBM, International Business Machines, around 1924. And over the course of the best part of a century, he and his son built IBM to the most valuable company in the world. By 1991, its market cap was approximately $105 billion, which then was about as big as you get. And that was achieved over this 80-year period. But what's critical, and why I would like to focus on Lou Gerstner, is that all of that success built over 80 years was undone in the next 9. So Lou Gerstner was appointed CEO of IBM in 93. Now, just like Scully at Apple, he was the wrong man for the job. He'd come from RJR Nabisco, which was a biscuit company. Scully had come from PepsiCo, which was a soda drink company. Now, what do these people know about technology companies? They don't know anything. It's completely different. It's a completely different skill set. But he was brought in and his incentives were all wrong. The incentives they offered him were pegged to the share price of IBM. So many companies do this, and it's completely the wrong thing to do. So, the focus of the CEO becomes boosting the share price, even if that's at the expense of the long-term prospects of the business. So under Gerstner, debt ballooned from 10 billion to 29 billion, so almost 3 times. Now, more importantly, that debt was primarily used for share buybacks, not to invest in the growth of the business. Now, over the course of his tenure, he repurchased 25% of the shares of IBM, mostly at overinflated prices, which destroyed shareholder equity. And as the share price inflated through this kind of false demand, if you like, through all of this repurchase activity, shareholder equity was being destroyed, investors were focused on completely the wrong things and they were reaching the wrong conclusions. Of course, as the number of shares reduces, earnings per share inflate. And it's not because the earnings are necessarily going up. It's not the numerator in that equation. It's the denominator that's changing. Similarly, the return on equity will be boosted because by buying back shares at overinflated prices, he's effectively destroying shareholder equity. So once again, you're looking at return on equity. It's the denominator that's contracting. So it's making these metrics look great. All the while, sales declines. So between 1998 and 2001, the sales declined significantly, but the share price doubled over the same period. Now, make sense of that. Again, it's because investors focus on the wrong metrics. They're looking at EPS, they're looking at return on equity. The foolish investors were ignoring fundamentals. And, fear of missing out resulted in a herd mentality. And so, people jumped in and they were chasing the share price. It was all about momentum, which was kind of very similar to what we saw with Tesla over the COVID period. Um, and it's over this period, over Lou Gerstner's tenure, the dividend yield fell from 7.2% in 92 to 0.4% by the year 2000. But blinded by share price gains, the investors completely overlooked the collapse in dividends. Now, over the course of Gerstner's tenure, he sold core assets at IBM. He effectively asset stripped the business. So, the data delivery network was sold to AT&T. Lexmark, the printer division, was sold to a private investor. The iconic ThinkPad PC division was sold to Lenovo in China. Software assets, including Lotus Notes and Domino, were sold to HCL Technologies. All the while, Gerstner slashed research and development. So he was selling off core assets, and there wasn't much research and development going on, so they weren't developing anything new in-house. Tax credits from his stock options flattened net profits. And then he set up an SPV, a special purpose vehicle called IBM Global Financing, to securitize all of the debt that he'd taken on. And this allowed IBM to move a lot of that debt off balance sheet, which was, it was naughty. It wasn't the right thing to do. He was effectively disguising what was happening there. Now, more of the debt was being used to finance customer spending with low interest loans. But Gerstner booked all of that revenue and profit up front. And he was using off-balance sheet debt to boost revenue and profit numbers. He leased lots of equipment to customers, which was a major source of revenue, but also, that was effectively debt financing, which again was concealed off balance sheet. Pension plan value changes were counted as income. Accounting irregularities eventually attracted the attention of the SEC, which summoned IBM top brass to Washington. And one of the things they looked at, for instance, is when the data delivery network was sold to AT&T for $4 billion, instead of that sale income being booked as extraordinary income, which is how it should have been, instead what they did was they reduced SG&A OPEX by $4 billion. So they were really playing with the numbers. His tenure at Gerstner's tenure at IBM was more about financial engineering than it was about computer engineering. I could go on and on and on. There were many more things that he did, but you get the idea. And all of these things provided a short-term financial boost, but at the expense of the long-term prospects of IBM that had taken 80 years to build under Thomas Watson. And it was all about the poorly devised incentive scheme, which encouraged Gerstner to think short-term in order to qualify for huge bonuses. And when he left IBM, his personal wealth had ballooned to 630 million. But the company, IBM itself, was a shadow of its former self. He'd caused irreparable damage that goes on even today. So if you think that he left, Gerstner left IBM 2003, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, and its market cap collapsed from 208 billion, which it had reached really because of all of the kind of accounting alchemy that he undertook. After he left and it became clear what he'd done, the market cap collapsed to 98 billion, after people realized that the company had been asset stripped, etc. So it had fallen from 208 to 98. And now today, 2 decades later, it still hasn't recovered. The market cap today is still only 128 billion. So, almost half what it was at its peak. And all of that was really because of the way, Gerstner managed IBM. Meanwhile, you pick up umpteen books which have been written about Gerstner being a model to be followed as a CEO. I simply don't understand it. So, it's all about incentives. It's all about a long-term objective. It's all about acting as a trustee of the assets that you're handed to manage as a CEO. And it's all about being on a mission. You can't be a mercenary. If you're invested in a company and you see any evidence of the CEO being a mercenary, my advice would be get out fast, and transfer your money elsewhere.
So what is it, do you think, that makes these CEOs care about what happens to other shareholders and not just themselves?
Well, yeah, it's self-interest. If somebody dangles a carrot in front of your nose and offers you the opportunity to be to make hundreds of millions, if not billions, in the case of Twitter, it's very tempting for some people to take that. Others see shareholders as an inconvenience. If you launch a company, you might be a software engineer, for instance, and you write a fantastic app which goes viral, and you decide to build on that success. You want to expand, you want to hire other software developers. And so you sell part of the equity in your company, and lo and behold, you find yourself as a CEO of a public company. You see those shareholders really in that context as a necessary evil. You needed to sell some of your equity to raise the capital you needed. You didn't do it because you wanted those shareholders to be partners. If you look at the Berkshire Hathaway, I forget what they call it, their investor manual. It's effectively their constitution. They say that although they are effectively a body corporate, they consider themselves almost to be a partnership. And they consider their shareholders to be partners, and they invest their obviously Munger's no longer with us, but both Munger and Buffett invested most of their personal wealth in Berkshire, so that their fortunes would move in lockstep with shareholders. That's the right way to go about it. But most other CEOs, they really do see shareholders as an inconvenience, as a necessary evil, and they're really focused on themselves.
So do you think that the CEO is almost more important than the business itself?
The CEO is absolutely more important than the business itself. I've given you countless examples in the conversation today about the same company in the same market with the same product, um, effectively having an entirely different outcome in the hands of a different person. It's the person who is the key to success. And so I think, before researching anything about a company, a deep dive on the CEO is really the most important. I think it's one of the reasons why some of the most successful companies in time have founder CEOs who are passionate, and have stuck with the company for the long term. And it was always their intention to stick with the company for the long term, which is why they always made decisions which were in the long term interests of the company itself.
I found it particularly interesting when you said that good management is willing to, either make good use of an idea or willing to chuck it away if it's the wrong idea. And it makes me think that a good CEO will be willing to abandon projects that don't yield enough return and favor those that do and think outside of the box.
It's not always the way. In fact, you know, effectively that what we've been speaking about is the exception rather than the rule. So exceptional leaders will recognize that they've got a mediocre idea and that the idea needs to be improved. And I gave the example of Intel earlier, which is really textbook case study. But then you want to look at others as a contrast. Look at Kodak. Kodak were the market leaders in silver halide film. Wherever you went around the world in the 70s or the 80s, you could be sure that you would see billboards for two companies. One of them was Coca-Cola, the other one was Kodak. It was one of the biggest brands globally. It was a hugely successful company. It was one of the Nifty 50 as well. Now it went bankrupt. Why did it go bankrupt? Because it didn't recognize what was happening in its industry. It kind of rested on its laurels. It knew that it was doing very well in silver halide film, and so it didn't embrace digital photography. And that was the death knell for it. Similarly, you can look at Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video was a rental business, and it saw streaming coming over the hill, but either didn't see it as a threat or alternatively didn't want to disrupt its own business model. If you analyze any of the financials from Blockbuster, you'll notice that the lion's share of its earnings actually came from late fees. So, for anybody listening to this who is young enough not to remember um, movie rental businesses like Blockbuster, effectively before streaming, what we had to do was go to a local store. We had to select a movie from the shelf and take home either a video cassette or a DVD to put in a machine and play it. And then you'd have that movie for 24 hours. You'd have to return it the next day. And if you were late, you'd have to pay a late fee. Very much like a late fee on a book at a library. And Blockbuster made a lot of money on those late fees. And so it saw that streaming was a threat to that revenue stream. And so for that reason, it didn't really want to embrace it. And that enabled Netflix to come in and claim its crown. And, Blockbuster effectively died. And so, yeah, there are countless more examples I could give you, but most companies and most CEOs are so married to a successful idea, even if it is mediocre or even if it's becoming mediocre. It may have been successful in the past, but it's becoming mediocre. They won't relinquish that idea. Another fantastic example is the BlackBerry. BlackBerry was enormously successful. Anybody in the early 2000s in the financial sector had a BlackBerry. It was not only a status symbol, it was a very, very useful tool because for the first time you could pick up emails on the go. You didn't have to be sitting behind your desktop. But it had a tiny little keyboard that most of us used with our thumbs. And when Steve Jobs introduced the concept of doing away with keyboard on a mobile phone, on a smartphone, and he introduced the concept of a touchscreen, BlackBerry refused to accept it. And of course, the iPhone took over, claimed all of market share from BlackBerry, and BlackBerry suffered as a result. They lost their market share in that particular market. And so, no, I'd say most management is mediocre, and they're not prepared to discard bad ideas or cannibalize their existing business. And the problem is, if you're not prepared to cannibalize your own business, somebody else is going to come along and cannibalize it for you.
If management, doesn't recognize these things and, they operate in that business, they do that every day, how should investors who are in some sense, a step removed, how should they recognize these threats?
Well, the themes are there for all to see. So you don't have to be inside Kodak to see that digital photography is gaining traction, and that it presents a threat to silver halide. You didn't have to be a genius to see that streaming of movies could be a threat to video rentals. One of the primary drawbacks in video rentals was limited supply. You go down to your video rental store and they may only have one or two copies of each movie. And so if both of those have been rented out by someone else, that's a movie you can't watch. With streaming, there are no such limitations. And it's quite obvious, that kind of thing is likely to be disruptive. And so, I think investors can spot these themes and, certainly raise them with the management at shareholder meetings and try and gauge the response. And if the management are, transigent and they don't want to, almost recalcitrant, they don't want to listen, they don't want to change, then perhaps it's time to bail out and put your money somewhere else.
To some extent, it seems to be coming back to the idea of the mission. So is the company out on a mission to make things better for their customers? So if you're Blockbuster and you live off late fee payments, it seems inherently bad for your customers. And not only won't they be fans, but you're doing something wrong. If you were interested in thinking, well, how can we use whatever new technology is coming along to improve things for our customers? That might be a better way to approach it.
Absolutely. Customer first is so important. And anybody who studied the retail industry and read anything about Sol Price and Sam Walton, these people always put customer first. Jim Sinegal at Costco, exactly the same. They've all said in the past that the boss is the customer. The customer has the ability to effectively fire everyone in the company from the chairman down, essentially by taking their custom elsewhere. spending their money elsewhere. You have to be customer centric, customer focused, and all of the super successful businesses put their customers first, and that's another theme that I pull out in the book, and I dedicate a chapter to that one as well. We cover all of these things today on the podcast, but I fear we'd probably have to go on for several hours.
That seems that you did. Could you share, however, some of your thoughts on some other key ingredients of success?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me throw in a kind of a curveball, something that a lot of people perhaps don't think about. So location is another key ingredient that many people, many investors will never consider. But it's critical. So let's think about Walt Disney, for instance. So he established his first animation studio in Kansas City, which is where he grew up. And it failed, it became insolvent. Did that mean that Walt Disney was no good at animation? Absolutely not. Did it mean that animation was a bad idea? Again, no. Did it mean that you shouldn't have invested in the nascent animation industry? Again, the answer is no. It's just like, for anybody who does any kind of gardening, they know that some plants will thrive in full sunshine, others like the shade. Some like very wet conditions, others prefer dry, arid conditions. And so it is with businesses. The same business in different locations will lead to an entirely different outcome. So Kansas City wasn't fertile soil for animation in the 1920s, and probably still isn't today. But as we know, Walt Disney, he was on a mission. He had a passion for animation. And so he moved to California, which is where all the big movie studios were located, and where venture capital that was focused on animation and movie studios was looking to put money to work in this kind of new, rapidly evolving industry. And the rest, as they say, is history. And so you've got the same person with the same company and the same idea in a different location, and the result was very different. Let me give you another example: the automotive industry. So we all think that the electric car was a relatively new invention, but believe it or not, in 1832, Robert Anderson of Scotland invented the first ever electric carriage in an attempt to move away from horsepower. Up until then, human beings were reliant on horses pulling carriages along. And so effectively, the first car was invented in the UK in the 1830s. And the roads in Britain were second only to those in France. And Britain also had plenty of skilled mechanics and engineering ability in the country. So in essence, the automotive industry ought to have been dominated by the British. They had the first car, they had the roads, they had the engineering ability. But that's not what happened. So Carl Benz in Germany and Henry Ford in the US effectively captured the market decades later. So think about what might have gone wrong for the car industry in the UK. And the answer was the government, the UK government. It stifled all innovation. It effectively enacted legislation designed to protect vested financial interests in the railways, which back then was the dominant form of travel. And of critical importance here is that many government officials were personally invested in the railways, which helps us understand why they were against competition from road travel. So as far as the invention of the car, it was certainly the case of the right idea and the right technology and having the right people, but it was all in the wrong location because the location, the UK at that time, was hostile to automotive technology. And Carl Benz invented the petrol engine in, I think, the 1870s, 1880s, about 50 years after the car had been invented in the UK. And Henry Ford didn't set up his first car company until, I think, 1904. He set up Cadillac, which then he went on to founding Ford a few years later. And another wonderful example is Silicon Valley, if I can give you one more. So the fascinating history of Silicon Valley is explored in more detail in the book, and it really is quite fascinating. And I won't go into that here. But there's a real high concentration of skill and expertise and knowledge in one place. that makes wonderful things happen in terms of the advent of technology. So, if two technology companies were identical in every way, but one was being established in Silicon Valley and the other one was being established in Europe, the odds would be very heavily skewed in favor of the US-based business, because that's where the skill set and the expertise and the technology exist at the moment. And so, as a result, if I was an investor, knowing nothing else about these companies, I'd be more tempted to put my money into the same technology company based in Silicon Valley. And so again, location is critically important, but how many people analyzing companies factor that in to their equity analysis? Very, 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 very few.
And again, it's maybe something that they think of more in the sense of where their sales are than where their operations are.
Yeah, absolutely, indeed. I'll give you another example. Think about Coco Chanel. She was in Paris at a time when haute couture was prevalent in Paris. You had all the couturiers, very, very technically skilled with needlework. She had access to all the most luxurious fabrics. And so, Chanel established a fashion empire because the soil was effectively fertile in Paris at the time. Had Coco Chanel tried to establish a fashion empire anywhere else, it would have almost certainly failed. A location is so, so, so critically important.
And it seems part of the idea of the CEO falling in love with the mission that they need to have the right ingredients around.
Well, that's really a chicken and egg type thing. So in my mind, having the right CEO will lead to the other ingredients being right. Walt Disney, as we discussed, was the right CEO for Disney. He founded the company. He realized that he was in the wrong location. He realized because of his passion that he had to move, and so he did. The rest is history. And so, similarly with Jeff Bezos at Amazon, he's certainly the right man for the job. He knew that he would have to make decisions that were in the long-term interests of the company, and that if that didn't make Wall Street happy, then he was prepared to take that on the chin. And in that inaugural shareholder letter that he wrote, he said to investors that I just want to set out my stall. This is how I'm going to be effectively steering the ship. And if you're aligned with my thinking, then great. You're welcome to be on board, and if you're not, there are plenty of other places you can invest. But he made it clear from the outset. And so it was all about quality. And you can read plenty about Steve Jobs, the number of times that he rejected technology that was being developed in-house because it didn't quite meet his criteria of quality, of aesthetics, of usability. And so he told his design team to go away and redesign either the user interface or the look and feel. And he was always looking for inspiration from others. I mean, you look at the Apple iStores, if you kind of wander into any of them, and the way they're laid out, they've got a very Japanese feel to them. That's no coincidence. He was very, very inspired by Akira Morita, the founder of Sony, and often traveled to Japan because Akira Morita was one of his mentors. And on that point, just as an aside, that black turtleneck that Steve Jobs always used to wear was designed by Izzy Miyake. Now, Izzy Miyake was the designer for Akira Morita at Sony. After the Second World War, when Sony was founded, it gives a fascinating story. I won't dwell on it, but just kind of touch on it very, very, very briefly. Japan was on its knees. Not only was it in recession, but almost half of Japan was homeless. Japan had been absolutely destroyed in the war. It wasn't a great time to launch a tech startup, but Akira Morita did it anyway. Now, companies back then, if they wanted to employ people, had to provide clothing for them to wear because the people just didn't have the means of providing their own, work attire. They were literally on the breadline. And so it is even today that a lot of Japanese companies still provide workwear for their staff, and Sony is no exception. And Sony has Izzy Miyake, the fashion designer, design all of its in-house workwear. And it was Akira Morita that introduced Izzy Miyake to Steve Jobs. And that's why he always wore that kind of turtleneck jumper. And so, all I'm saying here is that if you find the right CEO, you've got the right person steering the ship, all of these other things should flow. If the other things aren't flowing and any of these other ingredients appear to be out of place, the chances are you've got the wrong person steering the ship. And so they're all linked together. These aren't separate components. They're all inextricably linked. And so, you've got to look at long-term decision making. You've got to look at incentives. You've got to look at whether decisions are being made in the long-term interests of the company. The location of the business, is it optimal for success? Is the company evolving? Is it prepared to cannibalize its own business to evolve with the kind of changing landscape as we've discussed? But there are so many other factors as well. So a lot of the most successful companies nurture talent from within. And that's a really important factor as well. So if you are looking to promote internally up the corporate hierarchy, ultimately to the top of the shop one day, then that changes your mindset on the kind of people that you're recruiting at entry-level jobs. So if you read anything about the tailors who developed Enterprise Rent-A-Car, they only promote internally. And as a result, the people that they hire to be at the front desk, handing over the keys to a rental car, are the kind of people that they believe are the caliber of people that will ultimately be able to progress through the hierarchy and perhaps one day, run the company. Which means that even at the entry level stage even at entry level jobs, the caliber of person serving the customer is going to be that much higher than at the competitor, which gives you a competitive advantage. And you see similar themes at Costco. Costco does exactly the same. All three of its CEOs started at the bottom. In fact, Jim Sinegal, who was co-founder, started as a bag packer on the cash till. Genelec, one of the most recent CEOs, was a forklift truck driver and worked his way up to be CEO 30 or 40 years later. And you see these patterns emerging time and time again. Even Mark Leonard at Constellation Software, which is an entirely different kind of business because Mark Leonard is a serial acquirer, but he says that his hit rate hiring externally is no better than kind of 50%. And he said, why would you roll the dice and take a risk with a 50% success rate and hiring external people when he could promote from within? And so he tries to always promote from within for that particular reason. And so, again, and I pulled these golden threads out in the book. In these different, very, very different industries, we've spoken about serial acquirers in the vertically integrated software business. We've spoken about Costco, which is obviously kind of a grocery type store. We've spoken about car rentals with Enterprise. They all gravitate towards the same kind of a model. It's all about nurturing talent from within, giving people a career path, allowing employees to think like owners, so they have to believe that that they are going to benefit in the success of the business. That involves all other types of incentives, profit sharing and that type of thing. But again, these are golden threads that run through every successful business, and it's only a really it's only the kind of golden CEO that you want to invest in that will understand these kind of subtle nuances that have to be introduced to a business. It's all about culture. I gave the example of Lou Gerstner. He was the opposite kind of CEO. He wasn't interested in the well-being of of IBM and its shareholders. He was only interested in hitting short-term remuneration targets, and he became very wealthy as a result, and his shareholders suffered. So these are the things that I think are the most important to focus on when making long-term investments.
There's some, you told me a story about Patagonia earlier, and I thought that was very interesting, especially given how it departs from the conventional idea about ESG.
Yeah, well, Patagonia is a wonderful company. And the book of Yvon Chouinard, who founded Patagonia, I believe was called Let Them Go Surfing. And it's well worth the read. Now, Yvon Chouinard has achieved incredible success. And he has always put planet first, put environment first. It's the way he runs his business. He very famously ran an advert in the New York Times on Black Friday with a picture of one of his jackets and a big caption above the jacket saying, "Don't buy this jacket." What kind of person tells consumers not to buy their products? He did. And it was an incredibly successful advertising campaign. Now, he was saying that he was very much against consumerism. He was very much against, people buying cheap clothing and disposing of them. He believed in making quality garments that the people could use, effectively for a lifetime almost, because that's so much better for the environment. And although they would cost more, he saw it as more economical because you're far better off paying a little bit more for a quality item than buying cheap items which need to be replaced very frequently. But the critical thing with Yvon Chouinard is that he refused to take his company public. And one of the reasons was that he didn't want to be answerable to shareholders. He wanted to be focused on long-term objectives rather than quarterly earning targets. But more importantly, he was kind of laser focused on the environment and the planet. And bit by bit, he has put the company into trust. And all of the profits that flow from the company now go to environmental causes. But critically important is that he never publicizes that. That never features in his advertising material. He's not looking for a pat on the back, and he's not looking to win custom necessarily on the back of his own environmental ambitions. Now contrast that to this kind of crazy wave of ESG investing that we've seen in recent years. Most CEOs regard ESG as a tick box exercise, and they want to tick the right boxes because they know that there are all sorts of funds out there, managed funds, who will only invest in companies that meet ESG criteria. These companies aren't particularly interested in doing the right thing for the environment. It is just a tick box exercise, and so they contrast starkly with the approach of Chouinard at Patagonia. I could call out Elon Musk as an interesting example. So Elon Musk holds himself out as being a champion of the environment. He introduced Tesla cars. It wasn't his company, he acquired the company, but he built it up into what it is today. But he's always pushed that environmental line when selling electric cars as being fantastic for the environment. Now, meanwhile, what else is he doing? Well, he's got SpaceX. He's almost kind of gratuitously launching rockets into the environment, and God knows what that's doing for greenhouse gas emissions. Moreover, he was a huge promoter of Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin mining is an activity which consumes more power than the country of Belgium or the country of Austria. Now, the carbon footprint of Bitcoin is enormous. Now, how does someone like Elon Musk square that circle? How does he hold himself out to be a champion of the environment, pushing Tesla cars, electric cars, and at the same time promote other technology, which is incredibly detrimental to the environment? I can't reconcile that. I find Elon Musk to be a very difficult character to understand. And personally, I would never invest in his companies for that reason. amongst others. But Yvon Chouinard is really a model for other CEOs to aspire to. And if anybody hasn't read his book, then I would highly recommend it.
You, you have some strong views about capital allocation and dividend policy. Would you like to share some of your thoughts with us?
Yeah, sure. So far we've been discussing how, from an investment perspective, the people running the business are more important than the business itself. But the question becomes how to identify a great CEO. And this is really where the golden threads identified in the book become so valuable. Essentially, when all the best CEOs do something in a particular way, you can look for others who adopt a similar approach. So in answer to your question, capital allocation is arguably the most important task for a CEO. But most make really poor decisions without fully grasping the implications. So, let's focus on dividends, since you've raised that. Many CEOs feel compelled to pay them, not understanding that doing so is often harmful to their business. Compounding this issue is a widespread myth that a large part of an investor's return on equities stems from reinvesting dividends. So shareholders demand dividends unaware of the flaw in their logic. In combination, these two factors cause many companies to fall short of realizing their full potential. So capital allocation decisions should always be guided by opportunity costs. That was something that Charlie Munger always harped on about, and I believe that's quite right. A business is subject to a large number of outside influences, and the vast majority of them can't be predicted. So Henry Singleton always preached about remaining flexible. He said that he deliberately avoided making plans, and instead he would steer the boat each day based on prevailing circumstances, which has to be the right way to run a business. Yet most CEOs default to blindly following some kind of a playbook, regardless of circumstances, without any critical thinking. So effectively, what they're doing is they're replacing management discretion with a codified approach that avoids the need to make difficult decisions. So, do you want someone like that running a company in which you're invested? I certainly don't. I said dividends sit at the heart of the capital allocation issue. And as you'll be aware, neither Warren Buffett nor Jeff Bezos, for example, pays a dividend. So ask yourself why. If you're not sure of the answer, allow me to offer some insights and explanations. Back in 1972, there were a group of 50 top performing US stocks, including McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Walt Disney, American Express, Gillette, General Electric, and so on. And collectively, they were known as the Nifty 50. They were heralded as the best investment opportunities, and they were considered elite companies that one could buy and hold forever almost. And half a century later, many of these companies remain industry leaders. You recommended the name, you recognize the names that I've just read out. But here's the really interesting part. If an investor in 1972 had evenly distributed $5,000 across all 50 companies, so $100 in each, and held them until the end of 2022, 50 years later, that investment, that $5,000 would have grown to $609,000 through a combination of capital growth and dividends. Not a bad return. But instead of investing in the Nifty 50, that investor back in 1972 could have put that $5,000 into Berkshire Hathaway. Now, the really amusing thing here is that back in 1972, Berkshire Hathaway was a turnaround situation. It was emerging out of a failed textile business, and it wasn't considered worthy of being included in the Nifty 50. Yet over time, $5,000 invested in Berkshire Hathaway instead of the Nifty 50 would have grown to a cool 28.7 million. So the Nifty 50, 609,000, Berkshire Hathaway, 28.7 million. Quite a difference, I'm sure you'll agree. And this demonstrates the magic that Buffett discovered really early on in his investing career. And that's the extraordinary power of compounding retained earnings. Buffett achieved that astonishing annualized return of just under 19% on a CAGR basis, while the Nifty 50 compounded at an annual rate of just over 10%. And the key really is in optimizing growth by avoiding the payment of dividends. So, it's not rocket science, just basic mathematics. If a company, let me give you an example, a company achieves 20% return on invested capital and reinvests all of that back into the business, then all else being equal, the value of the business will compound at that same 20% rate. But if the company distributes 50% of its earnings as dividends, the compounded growth rate is cut in half to just 10%. And to put numbers on it, $5 million invested in a business with a 50% payout ratio, compounding for 15 years at 10%, will grow to 23 million in capital appreciation, plus 16 million in gross dividends, giving a total of 39 million on a 5 million investment. But without dividends, compounding at the full 20%, it will have grown to 77 million rather than 39. And the only difference is that one scenario paid a dividend and the other scenario didn't. The outcome, is almost double. So this is why Buffett realized that paying dividends is foolish, and it explains why Berkshire Hathaway outperformed the Nifty 50 by a factor of 47 times over that 50-year period. The longer the compounding period is, the more pronounced that effect will be. Which is probably why Albert Einstein famously referred to compounding as the eighth wonder of the world. He said that he who understands it earns it, and Buffett certainly understood it. So, those that don't get it underperform, which is why I said earlier that it's foolish, but a lot of CEOs just don't get capital allocation properly. They pay out huge dividends, sometimes because shareholders demand it. Again, shareholders lose out. And not only are they underperforming, but by not reinvesting all of your capital in growth, you're allowing competitors to capture market share, which you have unclaimed, which remains unclaimed due to the slower growth rate of your business, which really doesn't make any sense.
Why, given this, are companies and investors so often fixated on dividends?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And the answer really, if we kind of look back in time, prior to the 1950s, there was a prevailing belief that a company generating regular cash for its investors signaled its quality and reliability as a business. And so during that era, companies were really heavy with tangible assets, meaning that organic growth was slow. Acquisitions were rare at that time, and share repurchases, they weren't yet a thing. So with excess capital accumulating, returning it to shareholders becomes the default choice. It made a lot of sense and it was ethically sound. But today we live in a completely different world. Many of the leading companies today have an intangible asset base, which is really easy to scale. Mergers and acquisitions are commonplace, and share buybacks done properly are incredibly accretive to shareholder returns. But despite changing times, so many CEOs are still using their grandfather's playbook and still doing it the way that it was back in the 1950s. Now, really interestingly, although I've kind of framed it as kind of in a historic context, the debate about whether or not to pay dividends isn't new. So in the 1870s, we're going back a long way now, Sam Andrews was an early investor and a director in Standard Oil. He believed that consistently high dividend payouts would make Standard Oil stock a really attractive investment. But J.D. Rockefeller disagreed. He argued that profits should be reinvested to fuel growth and to strengthen the company's competitive position. So this disagreement was a source of ongoing tension within Standard Oil, and it culminated in Andrews being ousted from the business. And as we all know, Rockefeller went on to become the richest man on the planet at one time, and his approach was fully validated by the success of Standard Oil. But from an investor's standpoint, unlike other asset classes, a company can compound in value. So this is what makes equity investing so attractive. By reinvesting earnings, it becomes possible to create long-term earnings reinvestment spiral, which accelerates growth. And it amazes me that so many CEOs, investors, and investors, simply don't get it. So, the next person to kind of consider in this narrative is John Malone, the legendary CEO at TCI. He served there from 1973 until 1999, so just over 25 years. And it's important to understand that when he joined in the 1970s, the prevailing trend among public companies at that time was to focus on the optimization of net earnings. And to be honest, that mindset continues today. But Malone recognized back then that this approach was fundamentally flawed. So Malone recognized that earnings are taxed, which drained capital from the company. So he asked himself, why bleed capital to the tax man when instead it can be reinvested in a tax efficient manner that will compound for the benefit of both the business and its shareholders? But with little or no net earnings, there would be no dividends. But under Malone's leadership, TCI became a financial powerhouse. And he delivered remarkable returns for shareholders, averaging over 30% year on year for straight quarter of a century, 25 years. And in fact, every dollar invested in TCI at the beginning of his reign grew to being worth $900 by the time he stood down. And so, as an investor, if you've seen $1 of your investment turn into 900, would you be bothered about not receiving a dividend? By comparison, over the same period, the S&P 500, comprising of companies mostly fixated on maximizing quarterly earnings, so the opposite to Malone, and favoring dividends over reinvestment, turned the same $1 into $22. So again, a stark contrast. $1 invested in the S&P would have been 22 at the end of the period, whereas $1 in TCI turned into 900. Now, back in the 70s, Malone created a real headache for Wall Street analysts. They struggled with his approach, which was so novel. So they'd always valued businesses on earnings multiples. And so optimizing earnings was the holy grail. But Malone tried to help them through their malaise. He was doing the complete opposite. And he emphasized to them that evaluating a business, they need to divert their attention from the bottom line and instead focus on the earnings power of the business. Reinvested capital is not a cost of running a business. It's a mean of optimizing future cash flows through investment, which is where the real value of a business can be unlocked. So, reinvested capital reduces bottom line earnings, which makes net earnings an unreliable indicator of the true worth of a business. The important metric is how much cash the business is capable of generating in the absence of that reinvestment. So what Malone advocated was that analysts ought to look further up the income statement. And that's the way to reveal the true earnings power of the business. And this is how John Malone introduced the now ubiquitous term EBITDA into the business lexicon back in the 1970s. Effectively earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization is a variation on operating earnings right the way up the income statement. Unfortunately, today EBITDA is used for all sorts of nefarious purposes, which is why Charlie Munger referred to it as bullshit earnings. But its purpose is entirely legitimate if used properly, the way John Malone intended it to be used. And now, if you didn't know before, you understand where EBITDA came from. And just like Buffett and Bezos, we kind of discussed earlier, but Malone understood that the intrinsic value of a business lies in the net present value of future cash flows, not the current earnings. And that was reinforced in Amazon's 1997 inaugural shareholder letter. Bezos emphasized in that letter, and this was his first shareholder letter to shareholders just after the IPO. He emphasized that his was a long-term approach, prioritizing future cash flows over short-term Wall Street earning expectations. And that strategy, combined with his refusal to bleed capital in the form of dividends, saw Amazon's market cap grow from, I think it was 438 million around the time of the IPO in 97 to 1.7 trillion today. It's more than that. It's 1.7 million by the time Bezos stepped down in 2021. It is worth more than that now. But over the term that Bezos was in office, he achieved 43% compound annual growth rate. Quite incredible. And it also explains the danger of using earnings metrics to screen investments. How many investors look for PE ratios as a means of screening investments, and for this reason, it's flawed. And how many investors were deterred from investing in Amazon over the years because its price earnings multiple appeared to be high in the 70s? It only appeared high because of the incredibly high levels of reinvestment in the business, which distorted the denominator. And that's a critical mistake, and it caused so many investors to miss out on one of the greatest investments of the century. And even today, Wall Street obsesses over earnings metrics and earnings per share. They still don't seem to get it. And this kind of leads me on to a really, really interesting story for you. There's a lesson to be gleaned from the Federal Republic of Germany. So after World War II, the German economy was in ruins. In 1947, industrial output was only a third of its 1938 level, and a large percentage of Germany's working age men had been killed in battle. However, think about this, a mere 20 years later, Germany's economy transformed into a powerhouse and had become the envy of the world. And it was referred to as the German economic miracle. And in fact, Germany's economy has remained Europe's strongest economy consistently since the 1980s, even before the reunification of East and West. But the real relevance here is how they achieved it. So Germany introduced a 95% corporate tax rate. Yeah, you didn't mishear that, that's 95%. And it's not clear whether this was done to raise public money to be used to rebuild Germany after the war, or whether it was devised by someone who was an economic genius, who was thinking about second and third level consequences of the policy. But it worked out well. So, just think about this for a minute. With a 95% tax rate, how might that influence corporate behavior? If you were running a company at that time and you knew that your profits would be taxed at 95%, why maximize earnings when almost all of it's going to be taken away in tax? So what happened instead? Every company sought to minimize earnings by reinvesting heavily in growth. And with little or no corporate earnings, investors were neither motivated nor distracted by dividend income. And this approach led to rapid economic expansion, which, as I explained, is referred to as the German economic miracle. So Germany effectively achieved great success in exactly the same way that Berkshire Hathaway and Amazon and TCI achieved their own economic miracles. And it's all about taking the long-term view and preserving corporate capital, reinvesting in the business, and enjoying the power of compound growth instead of bleeding capital in the form of dividends. So just to give you some balance to all of this, a stark example of what happens when a really great company deviates from this approach is the unfortunate case of what happened to Intel. Once, a darling of the stock market, it was the undisputed leader in the semiconductor industry, known for its cutting edge microprocessors and continuous innovation. But Intel saw its competitive edge diminish due to a shift in the management strategy. And this decline, it can be traced back to the leadership of CEO Brian Krzanich, who he took over in 2013. And instead of focusing on long-term growth, as Buffett and Bezos and others do, Krzanich prioritized short-term financial metrics, particularly those related to earnings, because that's what his poorly designed remuneration package incentivized him to do. So to boost earnings per share, Krzanich made a controversial decision to cut OPEX, particularly in research and development, which is absolutely incredible and even more remarkable, since if you think that, Intel's co-founder, Gordon Moore, famously observed that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles roughly every 2 years, which we now refer to as Moore's law, which underscores the rapid pace of innovation required in the industry. And against that backdrop, Krzanich decided to cut R&D, which makes absolutely no sense at all. And rather than investing in R&D to maintain Intel's leadership, Krzanich redirected resources towards share repurchases, which does nothing for the underlying business at all, but it artificially inflates earnings per share. And all of this was at the expense of the long-term prospects of the business. So, the other thing he did was to delay transitioning to a more advanced manufacturing process. And he did that in order to reduce CapEx. And this decision allowed competitors like TSMC and Samsung to surpass Intel in manufacturing technology, leading to a loss in Intel's market leadership. And the delayed innovation resulted in a talent drain as top engineers left Intel to join its more advanced rivals. And compounding these strategic missteps, Intel adopted, relevant to our discussion, a progressive dividend policy. So not only was Kazanich deliberately restricting reinvestment in the business, but he chose to distribute the capital that should have been reinvested as dividends instead. And what he did throughout his term was he increased the dividend payment sequentially, regardless of opportunity cost. And the sum paid as dividends per share more than doubled throughout his tenure, despite the fortunes of the company declining over the same term. And he inflicted such damage on the business that by 2024, its market cap stood at 84 billion, which was down from 108 billion when he was named as CEO over a decade earlier. And it was a disastrous 11 years for Intel investors. But they've been receiving dividends all the way through, but taken a huge capital hit as a result. Now, Intel has since been working to reverse course, and under the leadership of the new CEO, Pat Gelsinger, the company has seen the error of its ways and it's begun scaling back its dividends. But whether Intel can ever recover from the setbacks of the Kazanich era remain to be seen. But the company's efforts to refocus on the long-term strategy, certainly a step in the right direction. And just quickly before I kind of wrap up the answer to this question, just another kind of contrast example. So I'd like to contrast the strategies of the two companies, Publix and McDonald's. So US listeners, particularly in the southern states, will be very familiar with Publix, which is a grocery chain which was founded back in the 1930s, which is a challenger to Walmart, particularly in those southern states in its domestic market. And it owes its phenomenal growth to the power of retained earnings. So Ed Crenshaw, the CEO and grandson of the founder, George Jenkins, affirmed that profits were the fuel for rapid expansion and helped it to succeed. And he confirmed that it was years before they ever even considered declaring a dividend. Now, had Publix opted to pay dividends from the outset, it couldn't have grown as quickly as it did, and it wouldn't have been as successful as it has been. And shareholders may have received a regular income, but the investment would have resembled a high yield bond rather than a growth oriented equity, which is how it turned out. But in stark contrast, in recent years at least, McDonald's took the high yield bond approach, and its business has stagnated as a result. So, quarterly revenues in 2024 are pretty much at the same level they were in 2010. And in the 14-year period, quarterly revenues have pretty much been stable. There's been no growth at all. Why has this happened? Well, during that period, McDonald's dividend payout ratio has been as high as 80%. So, if you're giving away 80% of your earnings rather than reinvesting them in the business, there you have kind of cause and effect, which is why the business has stagnated. So, metaphorically, if you want to consider Publix to be a thoroughbred racehorse, which is nurtured for high performance, McDonald's is a cow that's been milked to the point of exhaustion through the payment of dividends. I hope that answers the question.
Although there are strong arguments in favor of not paying dividends, how do you serve investors who require income?
Well, that's interesting. And, that goes back to what I said at the beginning about investors who don't see the flaw in their logic in demanding dividends. So many corporate boards will argue that they must pay dividends because a significant number of their investors require income. But, that's flawed thinking on two counts. So first, it misunderstands the real issue. And second, it proposes an ineffective solution. So, I accept that some investors require income. But, I would also state, and it would be difficult to refute, that many other investors don't want income and would prefer instead to optimize capital growth. So why should a company favor one group of investors over another? Additionally, why should a company dictate the timing and the amount of cash distributed to investors? Not all shareholders have the same needs at the same time. So, on that basis, it's an undeniable truth that dividends are an attempt to provide a one-size-fits-all solution, which is inherently impossible. Ironically, not paying a dividend actually offers the flexibility to meet the needs of all shareholders, and I'll explain why. So, through the liquidity of the stock market, those who need income can choose if, when, and how much cash to draw down from their investment instead of relying on dividend income. So, if the amount that they withdraw from their investment is less than the growth rate of the business, their investment still continues to grow in value. But if they choose to draw down large sums, which causes the value of their investment to stagnate, it's without prejudice to the growth aspirations of the other shareholders, which is far fairer than the way McDonald's have done it and paid out 80% of their earnings, regardless, which has punished anybody looking for growth. So this approach of not paying dividends and instead allowing shareholders to manage their own needs through drawing down their investment allows shareholders to manage their income streams more efficiently and to better control the timing of their cash flows to mitigate personal tax liabilities, which interestingly is why Warren Buffett has always advocated for this approach when questioned about why he refuses to pay dividends. But another common argument from corporate boards is that dividends are necessary to attract institutional investors. And it's certainly true that pension funds and the like do favour dividend yielding stocks for income generation and liability matching purposes. But income chasing investors aren't the ideal shareholders that a company should seek to attract. And the reason for that is that they tend to prioritise their own commercial objectives and often switch investments based on prevailing dividend yields. And they show little commitment to the long-term goals of the business. So allowing self-serving shareholders such as those to influence capital allocation decisions reflects, in my opinion, poor management judgment. So, to give you a good example of this is that back in 2008, Microsoft explored acquiring Yahoo. And it was a deal that was valued back then at around $44 billion. But the acquisition ultimately fell through for various reasons. But following that, pressured by income-seeking shareholders, Microsoft distributed the capital that had been earmarked for that deal as dividends. And that decision prevented Microsoft from using those funds for another strategic acquisition, or indeed, reinvesting in its own search technology development. And as a result of that, the company struggled to compete in the search and online advertising markets, which is where Google came to dominate. But crucially, and this is really important, many of the shareholders that pressed Microsoft for the payment of that dividend when the Yahoo deal fell through received a huge benefit in terms of a dividend windfall, but they soon exited. They moved on to the next company that was paying out a big dividend. They had no interest in the long-term prosperity of the business. They viewed Microsoft purely as an opportunistic source of short-term income. And so, Microsoft suffered because it arguably allowed the tail to wag the dog. And so, you must never lose sight of the fact that the company will always have shareholders. This is a given in the stock market because, for every seller, there's a buyer. So the real challenge lies in attracting the correct type of shareholders, which is those that are aligned with the company's long-term objectives, which is why Charlie Munger once said, run a company well, allocate capital intelligently, and the business will attract the shareholders that it deserves. And I think that's, summed up really, really well in this example with Microsoft. And, the other interesting thing to point out is that companies like Berkshire Hathaway and Amazon, despite not paying dividends, have never struggled to attract institutional investors. And I know that some listening will say, well, their size and prominence afford them a unique status. But it's really important to remember that both of these companies started small and they both achieved their success without the payment of dividends from the outset. So, does that answer the question?
Yeah. But if companies do take this approach and do move away from paying dividends, then what's the best way for them to convince their investors that this approach is indeed in their best interests?
Well, that's interesting, and I think Henry Singleton addressed this issue. So, as we all know, Henry Singleton was another outstanding CEO. In fact, Warren Buffett once referred to him as the best capital allocator of all time, and he always resisted paying dividends as well. So again, they've got this kind of golden thread. We've got Jeff Bezos, we've got Warren Buffett, we've got John Malone, now Henry Singleton, all resisting paying dividends. In fact, we had JD Rockefeller as well earlier, we discussed. So when Henry Singleton was questioned on the matter, he responded, what would stockholders do with the money? Would they spend it? Teledyne isn't an income stock. Would they reinvest it? And he said, since Teledyne earns 33% on equity, we can reinvest it better for them than they can reinvest it for themselves. And then he points out something which is really key. He said the profits have already been taxed. Paid out as a dividend, they get taxed a second time as income. He said, why subject stockholders' money to double taxation? And so Singleton kind of shifted the debate to the investor's viewpoint, highlighting the numerous disadvantages of receiving dividends. And he emphasizes this issue of double taxation, which is really, really significant. Consider this. So you're a company with $1 of pre-tax earnings. Now that gets reduced to 75 cents after a 25% corporate tax rate. Now, if that 75 cents is paid out as dividend, it may be subject to 40% income tax in certain jurisdictions, leaving the investor with kind of a net 45 cents of the initial dollar in his pocket. But it doesn't end there. That money needs to be reinvested. And after factor in the market bid offer spread and transaction fees and all of the other frictional costs, the investor might end up with 38 cents in the dollar reinvested. So, in that scenario, the only real beneficiaries are the tax authorities and the stockbrokers. So why would an investor favor such an outcome? In contrast, if the company had optimized reinvestment and minimized taxable earnings, as John Malone did and Henry Singleton did, almost all of that original dollar could have been reinvested to accelerate future compound growth. And it doesn't take a genius to work out which is the superior approach. So, it's really important to stress that there's a prevailing myth that the lion's share of an investor's returns flows from the reinvestment of dividends. But let's think about this mathematically. Dividends are reinvested by investors at stock market prices, which is often a multiple of book value, while retained capital is reinvested by the company at book value. So this distinction is really, really critical. What does it mean? Essentially, the return on retained capital will be the same as the return on equity being achieved by the business because it's being reinvested at book value, rather than being only a fraction of that number if paid out to the shareholder and reinvested by the stock market at a premium, multiples of book value. So the company is able to reinvest on behalf of its shareholders at a preferential price. And it's the reinvestment of those retained earnings, not the dividends, that drives exceptional shareholder returns, which explains why Buffett has achieved so much, Amazon achieved so much, Singleton achieved so much, and John Malone, etc. So, as discussed earlier, a company is capable of compounding in value. And this is what makes equity investing so attractive. By reinvesting earnings, it becomes possible to create a tax-efficient long-term cycle of capital growth. And investors preferring income over capital growth should, with few exceptions, be active in other asset classes, or else take Warren Buffett's advice and invest in growth stocks that don't pay dividends and simply draw down on a stock which is rapidly growing in capital value due to this kind of reinvestment process. So from a shareholder's perspective, just to kind of wrap up, one more point to consider is the administrative burden of reclaiming withholding taxes on dividends that are paid by companies in foreign jurisdictions. We don't all invest in our domestic market, and withholding taxes could be a real nuisance. Trying to reclaim withholding taxes is a process which I've found can be incredibly difficult, if in some circumstances not entirely impossible. So that's another reason to view dividends unfavorably. There are far more accretive means of allocating capital. So that's kind of my long-winded answer to your question.
How do you think about dividend payments in the context of capital allocation more generally?
Okay, let's kind of look at this through a slightly different lens. So if a business becomes unsustainable or no longer economically viable, it will wind down its operations, pay off its debts, distribute the remaining assets to shareholders, and this is what we call liquidation of the business. Similarly, if the return on marginal capital declines, the logical strategy might be to shrink the balance sheet, thereby reducing the business's capital base back to like a profitable core. And this is what we've seen in some industries, for instance, the tobacco industry. It makes perfect sense in a declining industry. And this is effectively a partial liquidation of the business, where you're liquidating some of the asset base. Now ask yourself this: is the payment of a dividend not a partial distribution of the company's accumulated asset base? And of course it is. And so, effectively, are the terms partial liquidation and dividend not entirely synonymous? They both refer to exactly the same process. Both involve the reduction of a company's net assets, shrinking the balance sheet, and decreasing the capital deployed by the business. So, this raises the question of why a company with opportunity to grow should intentionally shrink its asset base through the payment of dividends. Why partially liquidate a business with good growth prospects? It just makes no sense at all. And to make matters worse, some CEOs deplete cash reserves through dividend payments and then seek to raise growth capital via the debt or the equity markets. Now, in my mind, that's not only irrational, but it borders on complete incompetence. Borrowing money to deploy in the business in order to generate returns on investment makes sense. But borrowing money to facilitate the payment of dividends is just plain stupid. Many CEOs would not have previously contemplated dividends in these terms before, but I would suggest that they'd be well advised to do so in future, because it shifts the perspective and could lead to a more coherent capital allocation strategy. So, in terms of capital allocation strategies, the process, which you can see in the most successful companies, is structured like a waterfall. So decisions are made in a specific order of priority. So first and foremost, a good company will always focus on reinvesting in the business or building cash reserves for future investment. And if no profitable reinvestment opportunities are foreseen, the next step is to consider reducing debt or repurchasing undervalued equity, both of which benefit the business and its shareholders. But only when all of these options have been exhausted and cash reserves start to accumulate to the point of excess, should the company consider distributing surplus capital as dividends, which implies that the return of capital to shareholders will at most be an ad hoc activity paid as special dividends. It makes no sense to have a regular dividend policy and still less a progressive dividend policy. So, in terms of that waterfall approach, let's explore each of those in a little more detail. So even when investment opportunities are not immediately apparent, building a cash reserve in anticipation of future opportunities is a valid reason to refrain from paying dividends. A cash war chest provides flexibility for strategic initiatives and maintains the ability to weather economic downturns. Berkshire Hathaway is the perfect example of this. It's built a cash war chest, which I think at present, given its recent sell down of its Apple stake, stands at over $250 billion, and it still has no intention to pay dividends. And crucially, its shareholders have such confidence in Buffett's ability to allocate capital accretively. They're confident that that cash will at some point be put to good use, that they don't even demand the dividend. And Buffett's explained that, we have no interest in cash except to the extent that it gives us opportunities, which is how he's grown the business so successfully. The only reason, he says, for having cash is if you think you're going to need it. So cash combined with the courage in time of crisis, he says, is priceless. And he's proven that time and time and time again. He allocated his excess cash really well after the dot-com crash, after the credit crisis of 2008. It's paid huge dividends. So, he always said, as have most other good investors, that you've got to be courageous when all others are fearful, and that's exactly what he's done. And he's only been able to do that by having these big cash reserves that he's been able to deploy strategically when opportunity presents itself. But if you're in a situation where you don't have those reinvestment opportunities, he runs a conglomerate. So, he's got those acquisition opportunities. Not all companies work on that basis. And so if you don't have those kind of reinvestment opportunities, the next level of the waterfall involves consideration around debt and equity financing. So share repurchases are a huge topic in their own right, to be dealt with separately. So I won't go into too much detail on those here, but it's important to briefly touch on them. We all know that debt is typically a cheaper form of financing, because lenders face lower risks. There are repayments scheduled at regular intervals, and debt holders also have a senior claim on assets in case of insolvency. Whereas on the other hand, equity financing involves offering investors a stake in the business's future success, leading to a perpetual dilution of earnings on a per share basis and of the value of the business across a broader base of owners, which arguably makes equity financing less desirable. Yet the peculiar thing is that many companies will focus on paying down debt while showing less urgency to reduce the more expensive and less desirable equity financing, which has never made any sense to me at all. And the situation becomes even more puzzling if one considers that a dividend is a one-time payment to investors, so the short-term windfall, while reducing the share count through buybacks will provide remaining shareholders with a larger share of future earnings and capital appreciation on the basis of the value of the business, benefiting them in perpetuity. Share reductions are far more beneficial and accretive to shareholders than dividends. But meanwhile, most CEOs will favour dividends over buybacks, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And there's also a paradox to consider. So a CEO will consider the CEO will spend a significant amount of time presenting to investors, in person, by video link, through publishing written reports. And the aim is to retain existing investors, to give them reassurance, and to attract new ones. And in that context, does it not seem contradictory for a company to promote itself as a sound investment when it's opted to distribute its capital rather than investing it in itself through buybacks? It just doesn't make any sense at all. So, Buffett, Bezos, Singleton, Malone, they never seem to exhaust in this waterfall approach the first four steps. If they've never exhausted their primary options for accretively allocating capital, they never found themselves in a position where distribution of assets as a dividend made any sense. So, in other words, they never reached the bottom of their waterfall, which explains why they've never paid dividends. And arguably, it's why others shouldn't pay dividends either. And, eventually, CEOs see the light. So, let's take another great CEO, Mark Leonard of Constellation Software. So, he's an exemplary CEO. I'm sure everyone will agree. And in his very recent 2021 shareholder letter, he wrote the following. He said, "One of our directors has been calling me irresponsible for years. His thesis goes like this: CSI can invest capital more effectively than the vast majority of CSI shareholders. Hence, we should stop paying dividends and invest all of the cash that we produce. Historically," he said, "we have paid 3 special dividends, and for the last decade, we've also paid a regular quarterly dividend. But," he said, "I've stopped arguing. I've converted. And with the fervour of the newly converted, I'm busy demonstrating my newfound faith." And so, he came around to the same way of thinking as the other great CEOs. So, I'll ask you, kind of wrapping up here, Is it not uncanny how all of the best CEOs eventually see the light and converge on a very similar approach to capital allocation and dividend policy? And these are CEOs who operated over completely different timescales. We saw Mark Leonard converted in 2021. We had Singleton and Malone deploying this kind of strategy back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Bezos didn't start until into the early 2000s. But going back to Rockefeller in the 1870s, this was exactly the strategy that he deployed. In my mind, this is no coincidence. This is one of the golden threads that runs through all great businesses, and this is why I pull this one out in my book, in the chapter on dividends. So ultimately, companies that pay dividends typically either lack viable reinvestment opportunities, possibly due to operating in a declining industry, or else they have management that lacks the creativity and financial acumen to fully realize the company's full potential. And that explains why many high-performing investors, and I like to include myself in that number, use a company's approach to dividends as a leading indicator of the quality of a company as an investment. So, when I'm analyzing a business, one of the things I'll look at in detail is the approach to dividends. And if I see a company that's paying regular dividends, and having a progressive dividend policy and ignoring the opportunity cost, that's usually a huge red flag for me. So, so sorry for the long-winded answer, but I hope that's answered your question, Alex.
Thank you so much. And thank you, James Emanuel, for taking the time to talk to us today about your new book. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.